Welcome to another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast, the personal, professional, and career development podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Dave Peltz, and along with me, as always, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Joe Hamlett. How are you doing today, Dr. Joe?
I'm doing very well, Dr. Dave. Thanks for asking.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to our podcast. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We really appreciate the support. We're looking to do some really great things in 2025. So, with that, if you're viewing, you see that we have a guest speaker. It's been a common theme for the past many weeks. And Brandon, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brandon Mulnix, and I'm glad to be here. Been listening to the podcast here for the past couple months and really appreciate you guys, reaching out and welcoming to the show. Little history about me. I'm recovering ultramarathon runner, which will tell you a little bit more as we get into the episode. But professionally, yeah, I get to help farmers. That's what I get to do on a daily basis. And in a time where, farmers got a lot of challenges in the world, I get to help provide them the technology that they need to do their jobs better. But didn't get here the normal route, went a couple different ways to get here. So it's been fun. Got a family, wife who is a nurse, and as an adult became a nurse just a couple years ago. So that's been cool.
Wow.
And then a teenage son and the 20-some-year-old daughter, 22-year-old daughter. What kind of dad am I? But, once they get out of the house, you don't get to remember their ages too well. So, yeah, I'm just really glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brandon. Today's topic is endurance, something that, as a recovering ultra runner, Brandon is probably very thoroughly familiar with. So let's turn it over to Brandon. What are your thoughts on endurance?
Well, endurance, if I were to talk about, running, people most of the time go, I can't even, I don't even want to run a mile. Well, that's not life. People have way more endurance than they realize. They're on their feet probably 5 to 6, depending on their job, 5, 6 miles a day, don't even realize it. But one of the things I learned a long time ago is if I'm not smarter than the people that I'm around, I'm probably going to be able to outdure the people around me because I don't give up. And that came through by learning my addiction to ultra running quite some time ago, back in the 2009 2010 era, when I decided to lose weight. And I was really fat and said, hey, a buddy of mine's like, hey, I'm training for this 100-mile race. And that's where I got started, because I went, what? That's kind of cool. And so that led me on to the journey of running multiple races and doing some pretty crazy things throughout that time running those races.
Wow,
Wow.
that's you're right. 100 miles. I'm like, yeah, isn't that what they invented automobiles for, or bicycles, other forms of transportation?
Well, Brandon, that to me, that's very impressive to go from, like, it didn't sound like you were that active or were into running, and to set a goal of 100 mile race. I mean, what goes through your mind when you think about setting yourself up that type of goal, putting in front of yourself when you haven't again built up to that? I'm just curious.
Well, Dr.
What?
Joe,
What?
it's easy, because when you start, you don't start off with a 100-mile goal.
Okay.
I mean, at
Okay.
that point, it was, I want to run 3.5, 4 miles. I'd ran different parts of my life, but never more than like a 25K, 15.5 miles. And that
Okay.
was years prior. So for this one, it happened to be, I was so out of shape. I was with my daughter and we were running. It was a kids marathon, and it was the last mile of the Grand Rapids Marathon. As you ran that on a different day, and I could barely keep up with my, I think, 9-year-old daughter at the time.
Wow.
So out of shape. And so I want to get back into it, and I want to put a marathon as a goal. It was always a dream. Told a high school, cross country coach, hey, one day I'm going to run a marathon. And I also told her one day I was going to make Runner's World. She didn't believe me. I didn't believe it myself, but it did come to fruition later on in life, after some of the feats I had accomplished. But as I got into a community of people that kept, it was a run 15.5 miles, run 26 miles. And I hadn't even ran 26 yet when I signed up for a race in California that was 31. And I'm like, Okay. And at a time of my life where there was, there's 4 mountains in it, and I was dealing with some issues, and I named each one of those mountains based on those issues. And I accomplished each one of those mountains and crossed the finish line for the 50K and said,
Mm.
hey, why did I set my goal for a marathon? That was way too small. And from there, it was, there was always something bigger. There was always something longer. There was always more of a community out there. And so I just continued to sign up for different races. And I didn't finish a couple of those races. I got pulled out of them due to health, due to not being in a good enough shape
Wow.
or being prepared for them, which was pretty humbling when you're signed up for a 100-mile race and they pull you at like 40 miles and you've done 50 miles a number of times, but you get pulled at 40 because you didn't
Wow.
eat.
Oh my goodness.
And so there's failure along the way, but there's also success. And then that success actually led to an identity issue. Everybody only knew me as an ultra runner. They didn't know me as a dad. They didn't know me as anything else. And then that led to a lot of other problems in my life where I realized this isn't what I want to be known for. So
Wow.
that's
Yeah,
when I took and actually took a long break, about
Brandon,
10-year break.
this is your story is amazing because I see so many correlations with what you're talking with as a and using your experience as a runner, a marathoner, an ultra marathoner as a metaphor for people's journeys throughout their lives. They set a big goal, but then they never decide to do it. Instead of setting a small goal first and just trying to keep up with someone that's, well, in this case, was smaller than you, your daughter, your 9-year old. You're just trying to barely keep up. And then you mentioned it a couple of times. It is not going to be without failure. You're in a big race several times and they've pulled you and you keep coming back. You keep coming back. And you named those mountains. Hey, there's a goal. I'm going to overcome it, and you did. And this is what's fascinating about your story because I know we're going to run deeper and learn more about you. It's just a great approach to talking about endurance in our lives, in our personal lives, our professional lives, and our career lives. And then even you said it just near the end of your statements. Then you had an identity crisis because they only knew you as that. They only knew you as, and I'm going to use myself. They only knew me as a trainer or as a this or as a that. How do you break that? What do you do to change that when you want to change or need to change?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many things you can correlate ultra marathon running with, and failures and success. And how people ask, well, how do you train for something like that? Well, a little bit more every day.
Mm.
And you would then set little goals like, hey, last week I ran 10 miles on the weekend. I'm going to run 12 miles on the weekend. And it goes against all normal thinking. Every physical person out there is like, don't only go a little bit more, like 1% more. Well, if I was trying to do a 100-miler, it'd take me forever to try to do just 1%. So I had to continue to find my boundaries, find the things that would just knock me down, because those are the things I knew I then had to overcome. And then that translates to life. For me, I look at my career, I look at my relationships, I look at everything, and I try to just be 1% better in most of them because that's all I can physically do. But then there's those other goals that I try to push them a little bit, like 10% more or just even 100% more. Because I realize that if everybody just goes up 1%, which most people don't even grow 1% on a daily basis or a yearly basis, then I'm only on the status quo. But I knew in order to accomplish the big goals, the things that I would look back at my life and go, dang, I did something great. It was going to take much more than just 1%. And it was going to take failure along the way, because that failure, man, that drove me hard.
You said a couple of things. You talked about, just the 1%. And that's one of the things we talk about on the podcast all the time is just, progressing, moving forward. And it may be a small percentage, but the idea is that you're moving forward. And it takes me back to, when it got into bike riding a few years back. And, I picked up my old bike out of the garage that had been there for 20 years. And I started riding it, and I first rode couple of miles. Actually, the first time I rode it, I probably rode a mile, mile and a half, and I thought, "Oh my goodness, this is pain." So then the next day I went out. I went 2 miles, then 3 miles, then 5 miles, then 10 miles. Then eventually I was riding about 30 miles. Keep pushing myself, uh, you know, further and further. And it was even when I brought my daughter into this whole bike riding idea, she started with, the first mile we rode, I could look at her and she just had all this agony on her face. But then within a couple of months, she was riding 10 miles and it was easy for her. Back to your point, you got to be willing to push yourself further every time or each time, and that's how you continue to move the ball down the field. And so that makes sense, that you don't set the goal of 100 miles just immediately. You have to set those milestones, those points where you can say, okay, well, I succeeded this, celebrate, okay, time to move forward.
Yeah, every time I set a goal, it was like, okay, I want to run the 50K. I ran the 50K. Okay, what's next? 50 miler. Run the 50 miler. And within like a week, you're suffering the pain, the recovery pain. And then all of a sudden you get that adrenaline still and going, okay, what's next? And to have that, go from 50 miles to 100 miles and realize there's some dots you have to connect within there. And then life happens. There's things that I did not plan for between my 50 miler and my first 100 miler that I signed up for. I was actually nearly killed in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
There was February, I finished the 50 miler. And in July, the end of July is when I finished the 100 miler. And in between, I got hit head on by a car coming home from work, had a concussion, 12 fractures in my face.
Oh, wow.
And I had to recover from that, which is not very pleasant recovery. Right. And then also get back up to being able to do what I had set my mind to do. So life happens. When you set a goal, life happens. Yeah. No matter what. You're not going to be prepared. It's going to come out of left field. You just have to figure out how to adjust for it.
Wow. That's when you talk about recovery, I mean, that's a month, that's months long from an injury like that. And within 6 months, you ran a 50-mile accident where you should have probably needed 6 to 12 months to recover. And within 6 months, you were back in the game and running a 100-miler. That is amazing. I couldn't even do that even if I stubbed my toe this morning, let alone, and that's just walking to the mailbox.
Well, what I found out in that, and it was interesting because in the 100 miler, I was thinking, okay, now I'm there. I'm going to finish. But in the middle of that race, I had a sharp pain in my jaw. And I was like, this is not going to take me out of this race. There's my feet hurt, my body hurts. There's nothing. This is not going to take me out. Well, little did I know, they plated my face. And in the middle of that race, my plate broke in my jaw. Wow. I had no idea until I had the tooth removed that was broken in the car accident, but they left in place as a placeholder. Well, they took that tooth out, and now I have to go into surgery again and have another plate put in. While I had already signed up for so many other additional races, but the doctor's like, hey, I wired you shut again for the second time this year. But if you want to do what you want to do, go ahead and do it as long as you can do it. So that's where I went out just a few months later. I was wired shut and I ran 50 miles with my jaw wired shut.
Oh my goodness.
And
wow.
And along the way, it was like, okay, just another life happening, but I'm kind of cheap and I paid for the race and I was going to do it. And I finished it with the support of a lot of people, a lot of friends that helped bring me liquid foods on the course. I was able to finish that race. And that's what led to a really cool article in Runner's World that next January, where I was able to go back to my high school teacher and go, hey, I did exactly what I told you I was going to do when I was 18 years old and didn't have a clue that it was going to really happen.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a couple of people who told me I'd never amount to anything, and you're not smart enough to go to college. You're not this is not your wheelhouse. And I was able to many years later after I went to start, like Joe, not as late as Joe started, but I started when I was 30 going to school. And I was able to go back and say, hey, I've got my PhD. And they're kind of like, oh. And some of them were kind of like, oh, and just kind of brush off like, well, whatever. And other people like, wow, that's really cool. And it's like, those are those moments that you sometimes you live for, that you push yourself to go to, even if they don't acknowledge your accomplishment. And some of them do, and some of them will. Like my grandfather was so proud. I mean, he was just over the moon. And he was in the first graduating class at Stanford University. So when I got my master's, he was proud. When I got my doctorate, he was over the moon. That meant more to me than going back to some people who I thought were important at that time earlier in my life, who I now realize I'd left way behind. And I think this is kind of a good place for me to raise the question: how did you deal with your reputation as an ultra runner, and then having to overcome that reputation?
Well, trying to overcome the reputation came through, yeah, a lot of self-reflection. Seeing that I was choosing running versus spending time with my wife and young daughter, and the preparation of the future, not having a clue that car accident was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it allowed me to get healthier in a lot of ways. You see, I prayed for health right before that car accident happened. I was sitting there, I was at work eating donuts, going, man, I'm going to sign up for this 100-mile race, signed up for the 100-mile race. This is good. And little did I know my jaw was going to be wired shut. Well, that's what I thought. I was getting healthier. Man, I'm wired shut. I'm healthier. No. Actually, it caused me to rely on my wife more during this recovery and this healing time. And then to see the long-term negative effects of me choosing running over family, and me getting to a point where I have to choose my wife versus running at that point. Because I was running away from being a dad. I was running away from being a responsible business owner at the time, as well as a responsible employee for another company at the time. I was running for, I want to be the best. I want to be known for something. It had nothing to do with, I wasn't running for health. I wasn't running for anything purposeful. So when I had that reflection, it took another 1.5 years from that event to start to have that reflection of going, I don't want to be the ultra runner. I want to be the husband. I don't want to be the ultra runner. I want to, because on my tombstone, ultra runner doesn't mean anything. That just meant I ran away from my problems, and I could run farther away from my problems than most people. And that's why the community I was with, recovering drug addicts, military guys that were still looking for the high of war. So they go and do ultras. It was so many people that had a very similar running away from something, that once I got rid of, I took a 10-year break from ultra running, because I realized I was running from something, and now I can get back into it. And I realize I'm running for myself in a way that's different. And so the identity, to get back to your question, the identity was, I had to want to be something different first before I could change what I was. Because if I didn't want something more, like being a dad, then I would have just continued doing what I was doing, because I didn't know that I should have been doing something else. And it was ugly. I mean, it took fights. It took a lot of counseling to finally get to that point of, hey, I guess I've been kind of a selfish jerk for the last few years and kind of leaving my family behind. And
yeah, that your story right there resonates with me on many levels. And I'm not going to get too far into them, but that looking for that identity, that craving that high. I was military police. Joe was in the military. We're used to having a very, very high level of responsibility. And then when we got out, it's like there's something missing and you keep looking for it. So you keep pushing yourself and pushing yourself to be the best at everything because you feel like you're getting a little bit of that responsibility back. And then reality smacks you in the face. And for me, it was, and I didn't realize it at the time, was the first time I was involuntarily displaced. And instead of dealing with that, I kept applying for jobs and I dove really deep into teaching. And I burned myself out within 18 months of teaching undergraduate and graduate level statistics. So I took a job that was good enough, and I was still trying to just always be the best. And I ruffled a lot of feathers. But that was my way of coping with trying to get a certain level of responsibility back. So I felt good about myself. And then the last time I was displaced 4 years ago, 3 years ago, Joe even asked me, he said, what do you want to do? What do you, he says, we're different. He goes, I don't want to work for anyone for the rest of my life. I don't want to be that person. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be that person either. That's why we have our business together. That's why we have our own businesses. We've always wanted to be part of us has always wanted to be our own, accountable to ourselves. And that really made me start thinking, Joe, it was kind of like a kick in the ass from Joe to say, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm like, I don't know. What do you want to do when you grow up? It's like, that's one of our things. It's what do you want to do when you grow up? We're like, we don't know. We have an idea, but if you were to say pinpoint it exactly, we can't put that pin in that exact little spot because we don't know what's ahead of us. We just know that we've learned a lot of things from our past that we don't want to do. And there are things that we do like from our past that we do want to do. And that was a really big reality check for me a few years ago. And like yourself, I went through some behavioral health counseling to understand some of these issues. And, it's a challenge and you have to really dig deep and reflect it to figure out, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why does it make me feel good when I do these things? And is it the right kind of feel good?
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about counseling there. And the first part of my career, I didn't really mention much, but I spent the first 20 years being in public service as a paramedic, did some time in the Coast Guard. But I was on living an adrenaline high where I had a feeling that I was doing a good service.
Mm.
And I always had the adrenaline high. And so it wasn't until 19, 18 years in where I said, do I really want to do this the rest of my life? Did I make a mistake at career day and check the wrong box? And that's where I realized that just like in the ultra running, I can change my identity. I don't have to be a paramedic the rest of my life because you can't take that away. Just like I would never take away your military service. You served the military for the rest of your life. You can be a veteran and and everybody assumes what you know. That's great. But maybe that's not what I'm being called to do right now. And that's where I went back to a counselor and said, hey, what do I have to do to change careers? Read books, everything that I did, I became a student of changing careers during that time. And with today's resources, I'm going to go back and touch on something else that you mentioned earlier about, wanting to work for yourself. I work for myself. I work for a company. My paycheck comes from a company. But it wasn't until someone at one point said, no matter what you're doing in your career, you're your own brand. You may work for a company like Prism Controls, but who is Brandon Mulnix Inc. through that period of time? Because I've worked for myself. I've had my own photography studio. I've done that. I'm always accountable. When I come to this office, I'm accountable for me because I could lose my job every day. And I'm okay with that. Because if I give my best every day and be the best Brandon Mulnix Incorporated of the company, they're not going to get rid of me. But also along the way, I'm going to build enough relationships that I can walk into another career. I'm not going to be without a career. I just so happen to have one contract. It happens to be with one company right now. But I realized every day I come in, I'm still got to be the best Brandon Mulnix Inc. I can be in order to endure life, I guess.
You touched on something, the brand that you are your brand, and kind of like Dave said earlier, chasing, that high, and being in the military for so long, always trying to strive for the best, the highest, and that's what I think fueled me along the way for my education. And part of it was too was those naysayers that said, "Hey, you can be," kind of back to the conversation you both had about, proving to others who you are and what you can do. But I found myself continuing to do that to be accepted by others, which I quickly learned, not really quickly, but I did eventually learn that that's not what I should be done. But it's more like what you just said. I should be showing up for myself, who my brand is, who I am. And that's one of the things I've learned through my journey. And I, mentioned this offline, but the fact that, that's what education did for me was open my mind to the possibilities. And it did change how I viewed things and not just wanting to be again, become a doctor. That wasn't even in my cards. I wasn't even in my sights. But the idea that I changed the way I looked at things, and I believe I became a better dad, a better husband, a better, person, because I did really do that critical self-reflection and think about the things that were important to me, because I was working 50, 60 hours a week. Some, I would work 3 or 4 weeks in a row without a day off. And it didn't really, dawn on me until I could look around and see my kids are changing. My family's changing and I wasn't there. And so that's what opening my mind to the possibilities did help me understand that I had to be better um, in a lot of different ways. Not just again the education journey, but all these things in my life, and it did improve. Everything I did started to improve. So when we talk about that correlation between personal, professional, and career development, that's how it ties in. When you really start to take a look at yourself and say, "Hey, I want to get better here, but I also need to get better there." And it kind of just disperses, and you're not just singly focused on, the ultra marathon or this or that. You're spreading that more evenly across all aspects of your life. And that's, for me, that's what started to happen. I started to see, and even today I look at, even though I've had setbacks, the displacements and all those things, I still can see I'm still that person that I'm supposed to be. I'm still pushing forward. I'm still moving forward. And so that's what I've gained from this. Just hearing you and both Dave talk about that. That's for me has been very more powerful than again being the best this, the best that. But where do I actually shake out? I mean, again, relationships are better. All those types of things because of that.
Well, Dave, Doc.
Yeah, give me just a moment. We've got a couple minutes left, guys. So,
Okay.
Brandon, go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think in life, there's a time where we follow the how to run a 5K, couch to 5K program, where we follow everybody else's advice and we just check the boxes. But at some point in everybody's life, they need to take ownership of their brand. They need to realize that it's not going to be somebody else telling them how to do it. They have to figure it out themselves. And I'm so glad I had the challenges I had, because I had to figure it out myself.
Yeah.
I had to get through all of the struggles. I had to get through bankruptcy. I had to get through near divorce. I had to get through adoption. I had to get through all of these things that I realized, if I want to make a difference in the world, I have to endure. And endurance comes from within. It's not something anybody can ever give you. And that's the challenge, is take ownership. When times get tough, endure. But in the end, it's what you look back on and go, wow, I've got a foundation of that nobody can take away from me. This is my story. This is my journey. And nobody, doesn't matter to anybody else but me and my family when everything is all said and done.
Yeah. Wow.
Thanks, Brandon. I mean, that is so powerful. I wrote down, a few things throughout the conversation. Pushing 100% more failure as a driver and my foundation. Those are very powerful statements that you've mentioned through the podcast, and we want to thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with us. Joe, what are your final thoughts?
This was a great conversation, Brandon. Thanks for being vulnerable and telling us a little bit more about what I even had imagined. But you're right. It really comes down to how you want to be remembered. You know, what mark you leave on life. Again, do you want to be known as the ultra run or marathoner, or do you want to be a good person? Good family member, good friend, those types of things. So I think this went by really quick, but it was very powerful. So again, thanks for being on the podcast, and it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. So, with that, we'd like to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us for another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast, your personal, professional, and career development podcast. If you'd like to reach out to Brandon, who will provide his information in the description, I'm sure he'd be happy to connect with any and all of you. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode, please give us feedback. We love the feedback. We love the ideas that we're receiving for podcast topics. And yeah, it's a hell of a ride. So with that, we want you to continue being your not so ordinary you.